Hello, everyone. So let's talk about transcription. So what is transcription? Transcription is an attempt to provide a written verbal record of a recorded conversation. So it is the way we capture the data that is verbal in qualitative research, put it down on paper in order to manipulate it, in order to interpret it, in order to analyze it. So even at the point when we start to capture the data in the form of writing down what is said, we are already beginning to interpret because we have to make decisions as to how we're going to record that data in a written format. So it's an account of an experience, but it's also an interpretation of the events that are recorded. And I'll talk a bit about that in this lecture. It is a more permanent and retrievable and examinable content than an audio file. So it allows us to go over things multiple times without having to play the recording. We can read the transcript and we can also code it. And that is the way that we analyze qualitative data. And we will be going into that much more depth in the second part of this semester. So it is a way of beginning our analysis. It is the beginning of the interpretation that we're making of the events that we have observed and recorded. So it's a partial account of a richer interaction experience. So it's breaking down that interaction experience into a written format and then analyzing it, having it available for analyzing. So transcripts are not full accounts of what happens. They can never fully, completely capture the interaction, the interview, or the observation that we're involved in. And it is interpretive act. So, different people will transcribe in different ways. Because of this, there's usually not a complete accuracy in transcripts, and that's something that we want to be aware of and something that's well reflected in the way that your readings take up and problematize the notion of transcription, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in this video. So why do we transcribe? Well, Lapidat, who was one of the main readings for this week, describes very nicely the purposes behind transcription. So we transcribe to preserve data in this way that is more examinable, as I just spoke to. We also want to take speech, which is a fleeting thing, and turn it into something that is more permanent and manipulable, again, so that we can analyze it. And we want to sort, copy, inspect, do this thing called coding, which is where we take little pieces of the transcript, take little pieces of the discussion, and we assign meaning to it, and then we create theory out of that. And again, if that's all a little vague for you, we will make it much more tangible when we get into our analysis sessions. But for now, understand that transcription is the beginning of the analysis. It is the first step in order to allow for analysis to happen. And it also provides a really rich familiarity with the data. So when you're transcribing, you have to listen or you have to read the passage many times in order to make sense of it, in order to allow it to actually speak the meaning that the participant was meaning in the first place. So if you have to listen, if you're doing full transcription yourself, then you have to listen multiple times to that little piece of tape in order to faithfully record the entire conversation or the entire piece that is being said. And even if you're using software to help you do transcription, you'll have to read over what the software has produced in terms of a transcript because it's not going to make sense right away because talk-to-text software doesn't always get the words right. So you become very familiar with the discussion. Even though you were part of the discussion, it's a fleeting discussion. You might not remember it all during the actual interview. But when you go to the process of transcription, you see a lot of stuff that you might not have even seen or heard as you were doing the interview. So it becomes a way of becoming very deeply engaged with the material. And it also makes spoken language manageable. It allows us to use language as data. So one of the key pieces of transcription, or sort of one of the first elements to understand in order to transcribe properly, is to identify speakers. So when you're capturing data, you need to assign identifiers for each speaker. Typically, this is where we start to anonymize the data. So we won't even put in people's names in the transcript because that gives them already there's nothing written down that says X person said this. So we might give aliases, we might give numbers. In this transcript, you see that F designates the facilitator, and P is for the participants, and then we have P1, P2, P3. And it's a way of sort of transcribing an account of a conversation that follows the flow of the conversation. So everything that the person one says is going to be always transcribed as person one said this. So you can see in this transcript that person two answers to the question, where do people go when they have a question about sexual health? You can see in this transcript P2 says teachers, and then later, so the facilitator clarifies by saying, so we have friends, teachers, parents, and then P2 says yeah. So you can see that that's the same person, P2 who says teachers, and then P2 who follows up with yeah. So that is always important, that when you designate a speaker, that you keep that designation for that speaker the whole time so that you can follow the flow of the conversation. And so this means that we can analyze how the conversation has happened, because it's very important to us to know who's saying what. Even though we're anonymizing the data, we want to know which person spoke to the same themes, and we want to understand how the conversation has unfolded. So if you do one thing in a transcript, it's very important that you capture the data through identifying speakers and then link the correct response to the correct speaker. This is not very difficult when you're doing one-on-one interviews. It gets a little more difficult when you have multiple people in the discussion, because sometimes it's not always clear which person is speaking if you don't recognize the voices. So this makes transcription a little bit more difficult when you have multiple people in the discussion. But when it's a one-on-one interview, usually it's quite clear who's the facilitator and who is the person responding to the question. So what are the implications of putting oral interactive elements of conversations down in print in order to analyze them? So you might seem that this is pretty straightforward, but it actually, and we'll unpack that in this video, it actually involves making some decisions and making, again, some interpretations. So again, it provides usable data for analysis and for theory building. It is the first step in the analysis, and it takes raw data and begins to synthesize or interpret it. So it is very much an interpretive act. And so transcription reduces, to some degree, communication, which is both verbal and nonverbal, to words on a page. And in this presentation here, Dr. Albert Maharabian talks about silent messages in this slide here, and that much of what we're conveying is not conveyed through words. It could be conveyed through how we speak, the vocal elements, so the emphasis we put on which word, and it's also through a lot of nonverbal stuff that's going on. So, so when we're putting things on a page, how much are we losing in relation to the context and the nonverbal elements of the conversation? And if we're worried about losing those things, how do we try to capture them in transcription? That's something I'm going to talk about right now. In the video 3 Ways to Speak English, which is on the e-class for this week, Jamila Lysacott talks about and through her various social and linguistic identities. And I think this captures the concept of language and speech being much more than just the words that we're speaking. It's how we speak them and in what context we speak in certain ways, and how there's a very deep meaning and a deep history and a deep sort of social location behind a lot of language. So Jamila illustrates how one person can represent and enact many different types of speech, and that was related and responds to the context and to the identity that they're presenting at that time. And so speech and language and communication are very much tools of expression within broader systems. So again, this is why translation is an interpretive act, because we are taking that whole piece of the richness of language and speech and we're reducing it to some degree. And we have to make decisions about how we want to do that faithfully. So we have some epistemological implications, of course, related to this, given all of the things that I've just said. It goes back to the questions we were exploring at the beginning of the term. a more positivist perspective, that perspective that there is one, objective truth that we're getting at, would really try to make, a perfect transcript or capture with complete accuracy a one-to-one match of an account of what has happened in this conversation. But in our more sort of relativist perspective, which we tend to take in qualitative research, the more interpretive relativism version of representations of reality, that we feel that transcription is not is an interpretation, as I've just said, and that it does construct in some way a new world for presentation to another, which is an interesting concept that comes up in your readings. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that is actually happening and some examples of how we're interpreting at a very basic level when we're taking a verbal conversation and writing it down. So some of the key things that we start to do when we start to interpret in order to transcribe is really we have to figure out how we're going to deal with things like emotion, emphasis in discussion, pauses, things outside of the verbal. If someone's using a particular way of speaking, that they're emphasizing particular words, or that there is something, that they're saying, and it's very clear that there's a specific emotion behind it. And if you write it down, you might lose that emotion. Then there's other things that are happening outside of speech, like pauses or coughing or laughter, which might denote nervous laughter or embarrassed laughter or various different kinds of emotions that could come up. So how are you going to capture these things? This is the interpretive act. So I mentioned emotion and emphasis, and this is one of the key things that we also tend to do in transcription. So we may highlight certain words in a sentence so that when we read it back, it conveys the meaning that the participant was trying to say. So if you say, "I really don't know," or "I really don't know why she did that," or "I really don't know why she did that," or "I really don't know why she did that," you can say there's different meanings in those things. And there are various different ways to say this very short sentence. So and I'm not going to get into exactly what those meanings might mean, but because that would probably relate to the broader context of the discussion, which is where you're going to get into your analysis. But when you're typing down, just doing the transcription before you do any analysis, you probably don't want to lose that emphasis, because that emphasis could become quite important to you as you're doing your analysis. So if there are moments when people are really putting an emphasis on particular words, and you as you're transcribing feel that is a very important way to understand what is being said, then you can use things like italics or underline or bold or something like that to capture that emphasis and that emotion and that sort of meaning, rather than just typing down this sentence without any of that, which then might not lead to the kind of analysis that you want to do. You might be missing something when you get to the analysis because you don't have that emphasis in the transcript. Again, this is where you're starting to begin to interpret the discussion as you're writing it down. So choices you need to make. Do you mark certain words with emphasis to convey the inflection that is being given and perhaps the emotion behind it? Do you type out speeches full of little kind of non-speech elements, the ums and the ers and the likes? Do you type these out, or do you leave them out of the transcript? Do you polish up sentences if people are using the wrong verb tenses, if people are using a sentence that is not grammatically correct? Do you change that? Do you make it grammatically correct? Or if a person says something and then they say, "I want that to be off the record." Sometimes you're having a conversation and things are flowing very, very freely, and people start to discuss something, and then they say, "Hang on, I don't want that in the transcript." Do you still put it in the transcript and then put it in some kind of brackets or something like that and then say it's off the record? Or do you just not record it down at all? One might ask, what is the ethical answer to that question? And I think it again depends, as it often does when we're talking about ethical questions. As long as you don't use it because you've marked it off the record, then you could still put it in a transcript because it's important to know that something was said off the record. But if you use it, then you are committing an ethical breach. But perhaps you don't even want to put it in the transcript because it's very important to you that it doesn't get used. And if you put it in there, it might get used by accident. And you know, obviously, the more sensitive the piece that is meant to be off record, probably the more likely you're just not going to put it in the transcript at all. But this is a decision you have to make when something like that comes up. Do you mark pauses? How do you mark them? Do you put a little symbol? And if you put that symbol, how do you remember that that's the symbol for pauses? Are you going to keep yourself a little note or almost like a little, interpretive sort of guide that tells you this symbol means pause? Probably that's a good idea to do if you start to use symbols so that you don't forget what your symbol was meaning when you're using it in transcription. And how do you mark sections where you can't understand what people have said? You might put that in brackets and put the word unintelligible behind it, or unheard. And that means when you're reading the transcript or you're reading over the transcript and there's a part that sort of just drifts off, or this conversation is not making any sense anymore, you'll realize it's because you couldn't hear that part of the conversation and you couldn't transcribe it. You may also want to use timestamps in the document. This gets a little bit complicated, so it's more of a sort of an advanced transcription kind of feature to use, but and it obviously will mean that you'll have to engage in more time in actually writing out the transcripts, likely, if you're typing down, this was said at 3 minutes into the conversation. This was said at 5 minutes and 20 seconds into the conversation. So you probably don't want to do that for the whole conversation because it would get really cumbersome. But do you want to do it at certain points in the document? And where and why? When you're doing your interviews for this course, you may find that there's really 2 or 3 really excellent parts of the discussion. Maybe these are the parts that you want to timestamp. Because then you can go back to them very easily, and they are the most relevant parts of the discussion. Or you might decide you don't want to do that at all. You definitely do need to differentiate between speakers. So some of these things you do sometimes, some of these things you may decide not to do, but you definitely want to differentiate between speakers, as I said before, because that's really important to understanding the conversation. And so even in your one-on-one interview, you want to differentiate between the interviewer and the person being interviewed, because obviously those 2 roles are very different in the discussion. So this is, again, many different ways that you make interpretive decisions when you're transcribing. And it's not like we use the same thing every time. Different studies might require different strategies. So in some studies, you might want to mark a lot of emphasis. In some, you might not want to, because you're deciding to treat every transcript, without exploring the emotion behind it. So sometimes you might want to mark with italics, and sometimes you might not want to. So researchers might vary in the way they transcript from study to study, and no transcript is going to be produced. No 2 people are going to produce the same transcript, because each person is making individual decisions about how to interpret that transcript. I can transcribe the exact same thing as you transcribe, and those are going to look somewhat different, if not a lot different, depending on the decisions that we make. So these are some of the challenges with transcription. Is tidying up the transcript an alteration of the data? If you do any interpretation, you're going to do some, but when you do that, what are you doing? Are you changing the data? You have to ask yourself that question. But you might also be missing something. If you don't the reason we wanted to put some of those alterations is because it actually might speak to the data rather than alter the data. But you might do it in a way that isn't faithful to the discussion, and that might be a problem. So here's a sentence structure: I hate it, you know I do, versus I hate it, you know I do. So what is the difference there? One seems a lot more clear that they hate this thing, or they feel that the person should know that. And the other one might be more questioning. But it also might be a practice of speech, is a way of saying, I think you know that I do hate this. So you really have to, and this, I mean, it's kind of impossible to know what the right answer is when we take these things out of context. But in the discussion, you're gonna have a sense of what the meaning was, because there's a broader discussion behind that. And so you as a transcriber need to decide how you're going to capture that based on the meaning that is being conveyed. And so obviously that can be very helpful to transcribe your own data because you remember the conversation. You were the person who was part of the conversation. Do you use quotation marks? Do you yes? Do you do any kind of mistakes in the transcript? So this is a mistake here. Evaluation model becomes a violation of the model. And obviously, if you're not listening carefully, or if your software makes a mistake, then you could make unavoidable avoidable mistakes that are going to change the meaning of your transcript. So it's also really important to give yourself a lot of time and to do transcription in a way that is very careful and to check it. And so again, this is why you need to go over the transcript. Even if you use a software, the software is going to do stuff like taking an evaluation model and turning it into a violation of the model. So you need to really clean those transcripts. And even if you type your transcript yourself without using any software, you might want to also go over it, because you're probably going to make some mistakes. And when you re-listen to it and read your transcript as you're listening to the recording, you'll say, "Oh yeah, I got that one wrong." So you know, transcription is a detailed sort of process that requires a lot of focus. There are also some ethical questions to transcription. So if we take transcription, that verbatim transcription, there's going to be a lot of things in that transcript that are sort of ums and ahs, or sometimes incoherent. And there is some question as to whether, if we take those transcripts and we publish them without doing some interpretation, or if we just treat them as completely verbatim, perhaps that might actually contribute to stigmatization. And not even just stigmatization, but a sense of discomfort. Even my, you know, I imagine you might connect to this. If there was a transcript of this recording right now that was completely verbatim, I would probably read over it, and I probably wouldn't feel great about what I'd said. I would probably feel uncomfortable with the fact that there's a lot of pieces of the ofs that I just said just now. There's a lot of ofs. And so the what I hope is good meaning behind the words might be lost in the fact that when you read it in verbatim, it looks uncomfortable, it looks stilted, it looks like I haven't really spoken very well. So, you know, in language, when we're speaking, those things come out pretty naturally. But when we read them in transcribed, in a verbatim transcription, they all of a sudden look and feel more stilted. So here's an example of a transcript that is from a study that I was recently just involved in. So this participant says, and this is actually the transcript that was generated by the talk-to-text recording. So this transcript was generated by software, and it looked like this when it came back from the software. And so you can see that each of the times the person paused in speaking, it created a new line in the software. And there's also a lot of ums and likes that have been included because it's a verbatim transcript of this person's speech. And so when I went into cleaning the transcript, I did a few things. Number one, I edited out pieces that I felt in reading the text would not follow the flow of conversation. So I edited out the person said something twice. I edited out the second time they said it. And I also edited out a few justs and likes in order to create a better flow to this. So if I'm using this as a quote in my data presentation, so if this is a big part of my data analysis and I actually put in this verbatim quote, then even though I'm using a verbatim quote, I might not put every single word in it so that the quote reads better, so that it sounds what it was meant to sound like. Even though there have been extra words in there that might create, reading it might make it less intelligible. So you can see, if you read this, if I put this in a paper, this would probably be hard to read, and it would probably miss a little bit the meaning of what the person is trying to say. But if you clean it up and then you put it into a full, one kind of package that takes out a lot of the likes and the ums, you can actually read. I feel like you use the drone to its full potential. Like, you experimented with so many different landscapes, and yeah, I really enjoyed all the different things you did with it. And my favorite scene was the one with the yellow fabric that was so nice, very Bollywood. Yeah, it's been really fun watching your drone journey, for sure. So reading that in this format, the way I've cleaned it up, I feel actually captures the voice of the participant, of the person speaking, better than if I presented it in this format, or even in this format. So I am making edits, but I'm doing so because I'm trying to capture in writing the meaning that the person has conveyed, rather than all of the different ums and ahs, which sometimes when you read it in writing, they actually don't, it creates a confusion in capturing the meaning that the person has said. So this is the reason that you do this interpretation, but of course at the same time you are making interpretive decisions. So no matter what you do, you definitely want to be clear about why you're doing it. So because this whole notion of being interpretive is a really significant part of transcribing, then you want to be consistent. So again, if you're using the same symbol over and over again, you want to make sure you're using it for the same reason. So you might not want to use something like a star and then use that star for every kind of emphasis that you want to use. You might want to use a different symbol if you're denoting something like a pause, versus if you're denoting a cough, you might want to use a different symbol. If you're using italics to emphasize a word, then you probably don't want to use italics to make something off the record. You want to make sure that you're having consistency in the way that you transcribe. And this is where you kind of have an audit trail. So every time you make a decision, you write down a little legend, kind of like when you're reading a map, that gives you the trail of what that decision was. Something like a code book is also another way of thinking about making a legend. So this is, a code book means if I use a star to denote a silence, then I write star equals silence, and that's part of my code book. And you also often will want to check the transcript with the people who were part of the research. So giving it back to them once you've created the transcript and saying, did I faithfully capture our discussion here? Is there something in it when you read it over that you say, no, I didn't say that, or I didn't say it in that way? And then you also, again, need to be able to defend your decisions. So even if the person comes back to you and says, no, I didn't say it in that way, you might feel that they did. And that creates a little bit of a decision, again, where you might want to record in your research that the person actually wanted something else said when they reread the transcript. And then that might be something you either want to defend in your research, you might want to change it if you feel like the person was right and you did get it wrong, or you might want to have both versions as part of your data. And so it's really important to be mindful and reflexive, again, as you're doing this work. Certainly if you put out something to your participants and they do feel like it was not faithfully captured, I think it's very important that you listen to your participants and that you be very reflexive as to why they might think that way. And that, that comes down to the sort of positionality pieces that we were talking about. It's really important to honor and respect the people that you're interviewing. But you could also defend your decisions and say, when I listen to the transcript, I'm really hearing this. And both pieces can be important to your research, but it definitely is very important to honor the participants in the purpose of doing this research. And that is a real mindful thing that you need to keep in front of mind as you're doing this interpretation. So you often will sometimes include in the final write-up how the transcription decisions were made, and why you made certain decisions. That might be something that you actually write in your final paper. And certainly for your paper that you're doing for this class, you're doing a reflection on the process of transcribing your interview. So you're going to be talking directly about why you made the decisions that you made in your transcription. Again, keeping an audit trail of why you made certain decisions and writing that down. And also making sure that you have a really good recording. The better the recording, the better you're able to really hear what is being said, the better you're going to be able to capture it and put it down faithfully so that it's interpreted correctly. So let's finish off here with some options for transcribing. So I mentioned talk-to-text software, and I also mentioned just transcribing without software, which means you are listening to the tape and you're transcribing the whole conversation, which means you're going to stop it every minute or so, write down what you just heard, start the tape again, and continue writing down the rest of the conversation. If you use talk-to-text software, obviously this might save you a little bit of time because it takes a long time to go over a 45-minute interview if you're stopping it every minute. But again, the software is not going to get a faithful transcript. It is going to get some words quite wrong. And so you're going to have to go over the transcript and clean it up. And so you're going to want to clean it up because it's going to get some words wrong, but you're also going to want to clean it up in the way that I showed you in the example that I just provided, because there's going to be a lot of breaks. The flow of the conversation is not going to be captured super well in using a software. And even the denoting between speakers might not be captured super well. So even if you do use software, that doesn't necessarily save you tons of time because you have to go back over and edit that down. So here's an example of a recording and the software that gets produced. And so, you can see that this one actually, different softwares work differently. This one just comes out as one big paragraph. So you would probably find this really hard to, not very appealing to analyze. So what you would maybe want to do right away is go back in and start putting in breaks in the conversation, or breaks so that it breaks in the text that represent the flow of the conversation. And then there's also going to be words in here that are going to be captured incorrectly that you're going to have to go over and correctly capture. Here's an example, some funny examples that relate to transcription errors related to medical things or medical transcripts dealing with medical issues. And you can see some of them are quite funny. I really like the lab test indicated abnormal lever function when it was meant to be liver, or the circumcised genitalia versus circumcised. So, these are funny illustrations of how software can get it wrong. But it also shows how these things can radically change, these errors can radically change the meaning of what is being said. So, if you do decide to use software, you have a video that was assigned for which is in eClass this week, which tells you some ways that you can do it for free. So there is a Google Docs function that allows for transcription. So you can play the recording of your interview, and the Google Doc will listen to it and transcribe it. There are also some mobile phone options for transcription, which is discussed in this video. So if you have a word processing app on your phone, what is said in the video is that phones often have better speakers. So if you play that if you play your video, to your phone's word processing app, then it will transcribe what is being said, and might have a good accuracy to it. So you can go over that video, and it goes a little bit more in depth into how to use these talk-to-text options. I have not used these, so I don't have any real kind of technical savvy related to these particular options, but I imagine you folks have quite a lot of that. So if you're really interested in exploring talk-to-text options, these are some free ones that you might find quite useful. Zoom does also have a transcript function, which is something that I have used, and I find that it is it's useful and it's fairly effective. The transcript function in Zoom usually gets most of the words correct. But as I just showed you in the example that I shared, it requires a lot of editing because it does break the conversation up into different lines quite a bit. But unfortunately, in your York student accounts, this function is not available. It's really available for accounts that allow you to record to the cloud. So you first need to have functionality to allow recording to the cloud in Zoom, and then that will allow you to transcribe. So if you have a Zoom account that's paid, then that you're paying for personally, or that somebody like a work or something like that is paying for, then you probably will have record to cloud function. But unfortunately for your York Zoom accounts, your student Zoom accounts, that functionality doesn't exist. So if you're using your York Zoom account, you will not be able to access the Zoom transcript function. But you do have these options of Google Docs or perhaps your phone word processing app, which likely will allow you to do talk-to-text transcription, and these are the Google and many of the word processing apps on the phone are free. The transcription there is free. So that's a sort of overview and interpretation of the interpretive act of transcription. We'll have a chance on our Zoom session to delve a little bit more deeply into this. If you have any questions, please record them, write them down right now, and then we can discuss these in the Zoom. And then you will also have a chance to develop a guide for yourself of how you're going to do your own transcription in your tutorials. So in your next tutorials, you're going to do a little small group exercise where you work with another student and you come up with a plan as to how you're going to approach your transcription for your interview, and give yourself a little guide for how you're going to deal with some of the things that I've covered in this video. But one thing I really do want to emphasize is how long transcription takes. So you can see from this little graph here, if you have 2 hours of an interview where you're meeting with your participant, or whether it's an interview or an informal kind of participation observation, you're going to want 1 hour of prep. You're going to want a few hours of reflection afterwards, but you're probably going to have for each hour that you're with the participant at least 3 hours to transcribe. So transcription takes a long time. It takes way more time than you probably think it will. If you've never done it before, probably seems pretty straightforward. Okay, I listen to the tape, I record down what it said. But in order to do the kind of transcription that I've just talked about here, where you're making decisions, where you're typing everything out, where you're ensuring that there's a really good flow of the conversation and you're marking down the speakers accurately, you have to be very slow. You have to take your time. And so we often do say for each hour of recording, you have 2 to 3 hours of transcription. So it will save you a little bit of time to do the talk-to-text software if you do use that, but it will also require some time to engage with the raw transcript in order to make it intelligible. And the other real big reason to promote not using talk-to-text is that it might help you understand the data better, and you are going to want to analyze this data. So it helps you when you really engage with the data more deeply. It could help you with your analysis, or it could help you better understand the experience. And because you're going to be reflecting on both the interview process and the transcription process, understanding the data is going to be really important. So no matter how you do it, whether you use software or you don't use software, the more deeply you engage, the more information and reflection you're going to have for your paper that you're writing on this experience. So I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to chatting about this at our Zoom session.